Okay, we have a lot to do today, so we're going to get started. Everybody's here? Yay! Carbohydrates, okay? These are our objectives, basically the same all the way through. We are going to be looking at organic compounds. Those of you who had organic chemistry, this is just a quick little refresher. A lot of you did not. Basically, elements are organic or they're not, okay? The main difference is listed here. Inorganic are elements that do not contain carbon, and they're held together electrostatically, and they break up into ions. Sodium is an ion, and we will talk about some inorganic compounds later, but this first 5 sections is organic. So what's organic? They contain carbon, and they are held by the bonds to the carbons, okay, covalent bonds. They are formed by organisms, meaning animals and people make them, okay? They're considered natural products. We utilize organic compounds to make our energy for our body to function. And the main source of organic compounds for us to make energy are these 3. Carbohydrates, amino acids, which is going to be protein, and lipids. So this week and a couple other weeks we have carbs, proteins, lipids that we'll be talking about. And these are all organic compounds, so they're all going to have carbon and be bonded together. Carbohydrate is the most abundant of organic molecules. It contains carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And there's a little formula showing you, what do you see in there? Carbon and water, hence the name carbohydrate, okay? We mostly know it as sugars and starches in our diet. It is the major food source or energy supply for our body. We use them immediately, but we can store them for later. And as we all know, the American population is very good at storing them. We have lots nationwide carbohydrate storage. But believe it or not, they are not essential. What does that mean? You don't have to ingest them. We'll do just fine making them on our own. Because we love carbohydrates, don't we? Sometimes a carbohydrate will be conjugated to form these proteins and lipids. So they're all kind of interactive between the 3 main sources. We classify carbohydrates with 4 different criteria. First, the number of carbons in the chain, then the size, the location of this CO group called the carbonyl group, and that's what this is representing right here. So A and B are probably carbons with other things attached to them. And then sometimes we categorize them as stereoisomers. Okay, and it's mostly like 3-dimensional, but you could have the same formula and maybe put that carbonyl group a different place. Okay, and so that'll give you a stereoisomer. Think 3-dimensionally, even though we've got flat pictures up here, okay? If the carbonyl, that's at CO, is at the end of the carbon chain, first or last carbon, say you have 20 carbons and it's on number 1 or number 20, it's considered an aldehyde. If it's on another one that's inside, not on the two ends, then it's considered a ketone. And you have figures in your textbook. And I'm going to be referring to stuff in this chapter that's in your book. First, we're going to talk about monosaccharides. These are the most simple of the sugars. Okay? The very smallest one has 3 carbons. And it goes up to hexose is the most common one. There are some 7s, but I really don't know of any 8s. But your textbook says it has from 3 to 8 carbons. They're not very big. Pretty simple. Your number of carbons will equal your number of oxygens. So if you've got 3 carbons, you'll have 3 oxygens. Glucose is the most common one that we know about. It is a hexose. So how many carbons does it have? 6. Okay? And hexose came from Greek word sweet. You've also heard of fructose, galactose. You may have heard of glyceraldehyde. A stereoisomer means you have the same formula, but basically if you held it up to a mirror, you've got a mirror image. So this protrusion, the OH compound, might be on this side, but then if you had the mirror image of it, it would be on the other side. I'm trying to get some models to bring in so you can see the 3-dimensionalness of this to help you understand. Now, if this OH group is next to the last carbon, so say you've got a glucose, and we're talking about carbon number 5 next to the last of a hexose. If it's on the right side, it's tagged D. Dextro is right. If it's on the left side, it's tagged L. Levo is left. Now that one kind of makes sense. Left, you get an L, but D is for the right side. But you can also, 3-dimensional, you can go above and below the initial plane that the carbons are on. And so we can categorize it alpha if it is below the plane, so that would be underneath, and beta if it's above. And that's just the opposite of what you would think. It'd be nice if the above was the alpha and below was the beta. Those are the opposite. So we can put both of those. You can categorize if it's on the left or right and top or bottom. Okay? So you could have an alpha L hexose or glucose. Okay? And that's important when we go to our assaying to know it's a glucose, but it's this particular stereoisomer. This is, they're flat dimensions, so it's a little more difficult to see what actually we're talking about, but here is on the right, so it is what letter? D, and this one is on the left, so you have your L, glucose. Over here, pretend like, you know, you drew that box that's 3-dimensionally, so this is like showing you where the plane of these carbon circles are all together. Here, the OH is on the bottom, below the plane, so it's an alpha, and above the plane for the beta. Okay. The next level is the disaccharide. So the other one was mono. We just had 1. Now we've got 2. And this is where we take 2 monos and put together and make disaccharide. And you've probably heard that in literature or read about them. The most common ones are these 3. We do byproducts with sucrose. Supposed to be considered a glucose substitute, but it is glucose and fructose. And really that's what we call our table sugar. But we don't say table sugar anymore. Glucose and galactose, two monos put together, and that is the formula for the sugar in your milk. So people who are lactose intolerant, they can still have a glucose. And then maltose, 2 glucose molecules put together. Then you can go more than 2. Any more than 2 is considered a polysaccharide. And they can get really big, up to 2,500 units, monos put together. So they're huge. Starch, glycogen, cellulose. Now, cellulose, you probably can mentally picture that in your plants. Long fibers. Yes? Or muscles. They're long fibers, so think of that helping you remember it's a polysaccharide. So starches, glycogen, and cellulose are many polysaccharides put together. In the metabolism, we're going to start breaking down these carbohydrates. Ultimately, we're going to get them broken down to CO2 and water. You ingest a carb. In your mouth, the salivary amylase is going to start breaking down those great big polysaccharides. This is an enzyme in your mouth that as you're chewing, your saliva is going to be inputting the salivary amylase. Then as you get through the digestive tract into the stomach and on into the intestines, we're going to have pancreatic amylase. This is a different form of amylase than what's in your mouth. When we get to the chapter on amylase, we'll talk about that. But remember, they're 2 different things. Disaccharidases tell me that this is going to work on a disaccharide. Started out with polys, they've been broken down. Now this enzyme disaccharidase is going to come in and start breaking it down even further to get it to the monos. Okay? And then it dumps into your bloodstream. And it's going to, those monos are going to go everywhere, all over your body. All our cells are going to need them. They can go to the liver, and they will be stored as glycogen, or they're converted to be used. Remember, they were mono, so we can go to glucose to get our immediate energy, or we can convert to proteins or fat. So we use it in some fashion, or we're going to store it. There's really just 2 main pathways that our body uses glucose, but your book presents it as 3 pathways, and I'll talk about a little bit of difference. Do be familiar with this. I had a worksheet that I printed, and it walked away from the printer, so I don't have it to give back to you. It's got some highlights about carbohydrates, so maybe I'll find it. I don't know anybody else that would want 13 copies of it, but it has some formulas, and it kind of goes through a big picture of this, because I don't think you have anything in your textbook. The Embden-Meyerhof pathway, and these are scientist names, the EMP, is the main one that I do want you to understand. This is the process that this glucose is going to go through to get broken down to get our end products of CO2 and water. It is going to be glycolized to pyruvate or lactate, and then those move on to your CO2 and water in the process. In this process, they produce ATP. Anybody ever heard of ATP? You know, the STP you put in your car? Just think of it like that. That's the energy source that all of the human body cells need. So during this breakdown, so to speak, these are produced. They go into the mitochondria of cells for energy. Your cells have to have this to work, to live, to do all the processes, okay? That's the main pathway. However, we have a few cells that don't have mitochondria. Does anybody happen to know any? How about one? Doesn't have a nucleus? Yeah, your red cell don't have mitochondria. So that's not going to help them. They still need energy, but they're so full of hemoglobin. That's their primary job. So there's this detour. The hexose monophosphate shunt goes a different path than the pyruvate or lactate. It's going to go to this ribose. And in its process, NAD is going to be produced. And that is beneficial for your non-mitochondrial cells. But we don't have nearly as many in relation to the rest of the body. So the bulk of the pathway is the first one, the EMP. But some of them are going to go this way. So they can feed those cells that don't have the mitochondria. Okay? And the third pathway is, it's really included, but we're going to separate it because your textbook, so if I asked you for 3 pathways, these are the 3 that I want, is where the glucose is going to be stored. Okay? We're not going to make any energy, but we're going to store it to make energy later. Okay? Have you ever heard of the Krebs cycle, the citric acid, phosphate, any of those kind of terms? It's really complex, and I don't expect you to know all these. Some chemistry somewhere along the line, you probably did have to learn this. But if you kind of look at this, they didn't put in a lot of the, well, they didn't put any of the ATPs, but you can see the NADHs being made, okay? But this handout I had a much more detailed map. There's some terms that you need to know, okay? And they all get really, really, really similar because they have the same root, but they have to do with metabolism of this glucose. So know these terms and stop and think about them when you get ready to use them, okay? Glucolysis. I've got glucose. Lysis means I'm going to break it down. So that is the conversion of glucose or other hexoses from 6 to 3 molecules. The lactate and pyruvate are 3 molecules. And on to this, but the majority of the term is talking about taking a glucose and breaking it from 1,6 to 2 3s. Carbons. Let's go to glucogenolysis. We said that third pathway, glucose was formatted to glycogen for storage. Well, when you need glucose and you don't have any, those glycogen molecules then need to come out and be broken up to make glucose, okay? So glycogenolysis means breaking down the glucagon, to glucose. Does that make sense? They both are lysing to make the smaller component. Glycogenesis. Okay, genesis is to make. So we're taking glucose and making the glycogen that's going to be stored. So we're going to do a glycogenesis, then take that glycogen and do glycogenolysis, and then take the glucose that's formed and do glycolysis. Okay? Sometimes we use non-glucose or non-carbohydrate sources, which when we get into the next two chapters, the protein and the lipids, this term will be involved. Where gluconeogenesis, you're making glucose from non-carb sources. They're organic compounds. They have what they need there, but they are different, so they're going to have to be changed. So that's what the neogenesis is talking about. But right now, the first three is this chapter. Okay, so get those three words together in your mind. We're going to have a lot of GL words in this chapter. We know that we ingest glucose, and then we have a regulation mechanism, and we've all heard of insulin. It is produced by the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas. That's the only thing it really makes. And it will lower your glucose. It's going to get it where it needs to go and break it down for use, okay? So insulin causes glycolysis, but it also can cause you to store it. It's kind of like the determinant. If you need glucose or if you don't, you're going to store it. It is the only hypoglycemic agent. I don't want you to get all these terms mixed up. So think in your mind the process. I have glucose. Insulin's going to come in and determine what happens to it. So it's basically reducing your glucose because it's taking it for dispersion. Okay? Insulin is the only hypoglycemic hormone. Because it's the only one, with our population, we're developing problems because it doesn't have any backup system. We can inject a different type of insulin, maybe made from animals or chemically engineered, to help you, but the pancreas is starting to create problems for a lot of the American population. Totally opposite, we have a counter-regulatory system, checks and balances in our body, in a lot of different organ systems, but right now we're just talking about the glucose. So if insulin gets carried away and wipes it out, these guys kick in to counterbalance it. So insulin is a hypoglycemic agent. All the rest of them are going to be hyperglycemic. They're going to bring that glucose back up, okay? And they kind of work together, so one doesn't overtake. They're supposed to, anyway. The very main one is glucagon. Okay, there's others, but especially right now, we're concerned with glucagon. It's made in the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas. Okay, so they're made right there next to their next door neighbors, and they do opposite jobs. So the job for glucagon is to increase your glucose after it's gotten too low. Then there's a whole bunch of others, and the majority of these we will refer to when we get to endocrinology, okay? But just be aware there's a group of counter-regulatory hormones that are hyperglycemic agents. Glucagon is the one that we are concerned about. And table 6.1 stimulates glycolysis to prevent glucagon from making it too high, because it's just the opposite of the glucagon. Then glucagon, and I put the plus there so you realize there are other ones, stimulates glycogenolysis, and this prevents insulin from causing an excess low. And that's basically what that chart was trying to say there with all their arrows. But like I said, we're not going to get into the other ones yet. Glucagon. Now we're going to talk about diabetes mellitus. Diabetes is not really just a disease, it's a group of disorders where you have hyperglycemia due to defects in insulin production, action, or both, okay? Some people don't make insulin. Some people make insulin, but it's not working efficiently. And sometimes they have a little bit of both, okay? Because insulin isn't doing its job to take that glucose and break it down, we develop hyperglycemia, okay? Remember, it is the hypoglycemic agent. So if it's not efficient or not there, then we create problems. Over 8% of the U.S. population has been diagnosed, and who knows how much has not been diagnosed, okay? We have lots of people that are really sick, and they either don't know it or choose to ignore it. And then there's people along the way that are becoming in this category that haven't quite reached there yet. This will be again, but our reference interval for fasting glucose should be under 100. A few years ago, well, several years ago, American Diabetes Association was developed because we could see that we were having a problem some 60 years ago. And initial studies, our fasting was much higher than that. They were taking up to 120 milligrams per deciliter for acceptable fasting. But as we've become educated and found out things and done more studies, they've decided above 100 puts you at risk. So now we have a gray area. The symptoms you're first going to start seeing are anybody tell me what these polys are? Polydipsia? You just can't get enough to drink. Okay, polyphagia. You're hungry. And polyuria. You're drinking a lot, so you're going to pee a lot, okay? And some days I think we all have a little bit of that. They will start to hyperventilate and become confused. If you are with an older family member, you might notice sometimes, especially if they didn't eat or it's getting close to time to eating, they start getting a little confused, disoriented, and so they might be getting into this classification. They just haven't been diagnosed yet. And later, but as a FYI, our elderly patients aren't very good about their nutrition and fluid intake, especially if they live alone and there's no one there to remind them constantly. They aren't hungry, so they quit eating, and they don't take in enough fluids, and so they just compound the problems. Okay, the American Diabetes Association has come up with 4 different categories for diabetes mellitus. They started years ago, and they had different names, and as we know more things, we change the names because we like to make everything confusing, I guess. So I put 2 sets up here, but my generation learned juvenile and adult onset. If you've ever heard those terms, juvenile is young, adult is old, so to speak. But that's not always true to form as we understand the 2 different major ones. Type 1, type 2. That's the 2 major diabetes that we know about. Type 1 is insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. They don't have any insulin. So they're never going to use up the glucose. Their glucoses are going to get sky high. And usually it's very, very young. Babies, shortly after birth. But sometimes you do have a functioning pancreas, and you're making some insulin, and something down the road turns it off. And you guys talked about autoimmune diseases, some in immunology, and they're related to that. So sometimes you get an adolescent, teenager, or even early 20s young adult that is classified as type 1 because all of a sudden they don't have any insulin. Okay? So using the juvenile onset wasn't good terminology. So because they're really young adults and it's happening. Type 2 is non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. Means they have insulin, they either don't have enough of it, the pancreas isn't making enough of it, or it's not doing its job. It's not efficient at breaking down the glucose. Okay? And there again, that could be at any time, but it's generally in your older people. Although we're seeing it younger and younger people. Gestational is your GDM that sometimes during pregnancy can activate this, and they start having problems with their insulin not functioning well. They have insulin, but it's not functioning well. Their glucose starts rising. So as part of our prenatal care in our country, they check pregnant females' urine for glucose on a regular basis. And then sometimes there's just others. It's usually something else is causing the pancreas to not do what it needs to. If I had a tumor on my pancreas, I might still have those beta cells and making insulin, but that pancreas is interfering, that tumor is interfering with the pancreas. Something like that, okay? And you have several boxes in your textbook that give you a lot of information. Please go over those boxes. This is one of them. It's got a pretty good outline of distinguishing between type 1 and type 2. Usually type 1 is very abrupt, and they get really sick really fast. Sometimes you might hear about a young adult. I've got a couple of stories. I like to tell stories, okay, sorry. In the ER, a newly married husband brought his new bride in, and he couldn't wake her up. She was almost comatose, and her glucose was about 1,200. Remember, under 100 is normal. No history. So I guess getting married was very stressful, and she developed it that quickly, almost overnight. One of the, my boss's son, he played golf with my son, and high school golfers go play golf every day after school by themselves, and they couldn't find him. He didn't come home. He didn't answer his phone, and someone found him behind a building on the golf course, passed out. He was 16, and he developed it that quickly. Nobody else in the family had it. So it's just sometimes that quick. As a side note, sometimes people are getting that way and they become very, very disoriented, and they're blowing off. Ketones, this is type 1. They weren't sick before, they don't know anything about it, and they're approached. They got this crazy man wandering down the street. I think he's drunk, and call the police. Police come, they arrest him. And he's getting ready to go into ketoacidosis. They don't know. They didn't have any ID that says I'm a diabetic because he doesn't know. And unfortunately, that has created problems for people. But that gives you kind of the scenario of what the person's going through when it hits them. Some other things you need to know, the type 2, it's insidious. It's gradual. I don't feel good. I might start spilling some glucose in my urine, or my glucose is creeping up. A lot of our wellness screens will have annual checks on certain things, glucose and lipids for one thing. And, you might be fasting, staying around 70. Now, a decade later, I'm in the 80s, decade later, I'm now in the 90s. It can be pretty gradual to get there. Type 1, you just don't have any insulin. Okay? Type 2, you do have it. It's either not working or not enough of it. Ketosis. Be aware, this is a big difference. Type 1 will have ketones. And they go into ketosis. And they'll have a lot of ketones that we can measure in the laboratory. Type 2 don't do that. Okay, so they don't have ketone. And as we've learned about the autoimmune different diseases, we're developing testing for different antibodies, and so sometimes now we do measure these. We have been measuring insulin itself for a while, but some of the autoantibodies we're developing testing for. Those will be in your type 1, okay? Well, the complications. I showed you that graphic of how the fat is surrounding all your organs inside. Diabetes is related to hyperlipidemia. Remember in the first slide I said the organic compounds, they work interchangeably, and you have excess lipids besides the excess glucose that's not getting used up. And so you end up with some kind of heart disease. Arteriosclerosis is prominent in diabetic patients. They will develop blindness eventually. And if they live long enough, they're going to end up with end-stage renal disease. They're going to start having nervous system damage. You've probably even seen commercials. My feet feel like there's needles in them, tingling, the sensation, or they're just plain numb. The extremities, they don't get a good blood supply. If they get an infection, and this is usually on the feet, you know, you step on something or you wore a blister because your shoes didn't fit good, and it just won't get better. Well, you're learning some of this in micro, so you can kind of see how all of the lab works together. A diabetic has excess glucose in their tissues, in their toes, in their fingers. Now I've got an infection. There's bacteria there, and what do bacteria like? They love glucose, so they're not going to leave. They're really hard to get rid of, and sometimes these people end up with gangrene and they have to amputate just because we cannot kill off the bugs. And eventually death. But you can see they're going to have lots of problems along the way. So, you know, I wouldn't say that the diabetes is what killed them, but the diabetes caused other things that did cause their death. Okay, how do we diagnose it? Well, we know the term's fasting. For glucose, generally we say an overnight fast, so that's like 8 to 10 hours. Sometimes some tests need a longer fast, but generally don't eat anything after midnight and come in first thing in the morning and have your blood collected. But you could have fasting, you know, later in the day if you haven't eaten anything for 8 hours. That being said, when you talk to your patients, you always want to encourage them to drink plenty of water. We still got to stay hydrated, even though we're not ingesting food. They don't want you to drink coffee, even if it's black. So that's why our patients want to come in first thing to get their fasting so they can go get their breakfast and their coffee. But in addition to that, we take in glucose, and there is a time frame when the normal person will utilize this glucose. So you take it in, so your glucose peaks, and then your insulin kicks in, and it starts to be distributed where it needs to be or stored, and it comes back down, okay? Normally within 2 hours. So sometimes we'll do a 2-hour PC. That's post something. We used to do PPs, postprandial, which is a meal, but everybody's meal is a little bit different. It's really hard to control a meal unless you give it to them. And the chewing. Oh, I had an aunt. I mean, the whole family could eat dessert, go outside, play a while, come back in, and she's still eating. She's just very, very slow chewer. So that really throws off the timing. So we don't use meals for the most part anymore. We want to give them a standardized drink that has the same amount to make this test standardized. They do have to drink it relatively fast, which does make some people sick. It's just an orange soda, but it's a product that we'll buy. And it's usually 100 grams or 75 grams, even down to 50, but the facility will use the same amount all the time. And then 2 hours later, they have to drink it, and that starts your time. And 2 hours later, we're going to collect their blood. And hopefully, if they're functioning properly, they'll be back to their fasting level. But for diabetics, we've decided if they're over 120, that would be diagnostic. Please, please, please remember, you should never diagnose on one single entity, not one test, not one symptom. We have to have multiples. We don't really make mistakes. It's those other people, but you have to have two. So if you take your grandmother to the doctor and he does one fasting glucose and decides she's diabetic, demand another one. They should follow up. And generally they'll have a random glucose, and that could be at any time. And if it's elevated, then they'll come up back in and want them to do this fasting. Then we'll collect your blood. Then we will give you this product to drink and do a 2 hour. So we have two right there together. I told you normal was less than 100. So I've got this gray area in here. From 100 to 125 is called pre-diabetic state. And now they're treating these people, getting on the bandwagon, and usually it's a real strict diet to start with. They're watching them closely. In your boxes, you'll have a pre-diabetic state where under 100 is normal fasting, 100 to 125 is your pre-diabetic, and over 125 is your diabetic state. I think it also gives you the 2 hour PCs. You may have heard of a glucose tolerance test, especially if you've been in a laboratory. Are you working where they still do them? About 100 years ago, the ADA said, these aren't helping us. It kind of hurts the patient. They're time consuming, so quit doing them. And you see how that's gone. Until all of that generation of physicians die, we'll keep doing them. But so you may have to understand the process and actually take charge of one. So your patient comes in and you collect their blood. That's their fasting. They should not have eaten anything, but they can have plenty of water. Then you give them this drink and you start the clock. Now, depending on the doctor and the pathology, the facility, what timing intervals you're going to use. We used to, every 30 minutes, so you did a 30-minute, 60-minute, a 90-minute, a 120-minute. Then we went to the 3rd hour, 4th hour, and 5th hour. So that was 8 sticks in a 5-hour period of time for your patient. They already don't feel good. And sometimes they don't look very good, and they don't have very good veins. So if they weren't sick before, you probably made them sick. Then some people are drinking this so fast, they haven't eaten, they don't feel good, they get sick. They might actually vomit the material you gave them. So that's not beneficial. So through the studies, we decided that the 2 hour would tell us enough of what we needed, so we don't need all that other. Okay, so the oral glucose tolerance test is supposed to be foo-foo now, but we do still do that. And Sometimes they were looking for something else too, so they might even take it out to 6 or 7 hours. We had 3 different ones. We had a gestational diabetic patient where we just did 4 collections, but they got 1 amount of glucose. Then we had the traditional one for hyperglycemic that got 1 different amount of glucose and different hours of collection, and then hypoglycemia. So, and it was really, really long. So for the most part, we've gotten away from those. So the 2 hour, fasting in 2 hours, what you need to know. Hypoglycemic. Now we're on the whole other spectrum of the side. When your glucose gets too low, and for most part stays low, most of us from time to time, we are going to go low, especially if we've overdone it with something, either the glucose or some type of strenuous activity. We can probably get to hypoglycemia. This is mostly for people who are having a problem with it. A few years ago, this kind of be a catch-all, especially for younger people. Doctors were over-diagnosing people as being hypoglycemic and told them to eat all the time. Well, an adolescent is changing constantly anyway. They might need to eat all the time, but it's probably not this. So you may hear a lot of people be hypoglycemic, but there's really not as true hypoglycemic incident as it seems to be. Some other conditions and medications can swing you that way and cause you to be more hypoglycemic. If you take care of those problems, then you're not. So that would be a secondary. And there again, you're supposed to have more than 1 entity to diagnose with, and you've got a little box in your book called Whipple's Triad. If you're below 50, and I think they even have 2 parameters depending on male and female, but 50 is a good catch-all. If you're below 50 and you are ingested or given some type of glucose product and the symptoms are relieved, that's supposed to be in your chart. It's all on page 151, box 6-8, Whipple's Triad. And you feel better. Okay, how are we going to test for this glucose? This is where we come in. We know how to collect it. I have this somewhere, but just in case, FYI, anybody know the best specimen? We've got all these colors tubes. We're going to be talking about plasma and serum. So what's your best specimen? What color? Gray. What's in gray? Mm-hmm. That is the best tube to collect for glucose. And as we get along, we'll talk about it, but I'm always afraid I'm going to forget to tell you that it's a gray tube. That's the plasma. But you can test serum, you can test some other plasma, but the best one is the gray one. Okay, the very first test that we started with was a glucose oxidase. The reagent was called Trenders. It seemed like somebody kept saying Trenders for something. They must have recognized it. We don't use this as much as we used to. It's the cheapest of the methods to use. We're going to change the glucose to gluconic acid and add hydrogen peroxide. This peroxidase will bind to a color, and you see a color. That's your reaction, okay? Remember when I was talking about the 3-dimensional aspects, the left and right and top and bottom, D and L and beta and alpha? It is highly specific for beta D glucose. So you might have some alphas and L's, and it's not going to pick those up. We found if we added mutatorase to them, it will convert the A's to beta, alphas to betas. So we do that. If we're going to be using glucose oxidase, and whenever you have oxidase, think of peroxidase, and you get the color from that. We have this other chemical to help switch over the alphas to the beta so that we'll pick up more of them. There's still some that we might not pick up, but it is only for serum or the gray top plasma. It is not for urine. We can use it for spinal fluid also, but it's not for urine. It won't measure glucose in urine. Now, do you think you should have glucose in urine? No, we normally don't have glucose in urine. The better method and the reference method is HEXOKINASE. This is the method that we will be performing in lab hopefully next week. It is a kinetic method, so you're not going to see any color. It's going to stay clear all the way through. The only color you might see is the intensity of your sample. If you had a hemolyzed sample, it's red, you're going to see a little bit of that in your test tube. If it's really dark yellow, you might see a little bit of darkness, but not much. It's basically water is what you think you're looking at. So it's red on a low wavelength. We're going to be converting ATP to ADP and then NADP to NADPH. And that's what we're actually measuring. A decrease in absorption at that UV rate of 340 nanometers, which we can't see that activity with our eyes. It does have some interferences. Hence, if we have a hemolyzed specimen, we're supposed to get a recollect. Now, bilirubin and lipemia, we can't do anything about it. You remember what those are? Where they come from? What causes? An icteric sample is bilirubin. Anybody remember from, I think we talked about this in specimen processing last semester. Bilirubin is a breakdown product of your hemoglobin, and it's a metabolic disorder, so we can't fix it. And it's a fluorescent orange. We'll just note it, but it could cause interference. Along with icteric is the lipids, lipemia. It's kind of milky looking. That's a metabolic, well, unless they just weren't fasting, they were supposed to be. We can't fix it. But the hemolysis, we fix. We get a recollect. Ascorbic acid. Anybody know what that is? A lot of people are taking that right now. Vitamin C. And so we tend to have problems with ascorbic acid. There's some people that really take a lot of it, and it might create a problem in your testing. So if you get some really wacky results, you might find out, is this patient taking excess vitamin C? And they might be. Maybe the methodology. I did indicate that urine, you normally do not have glucose in urine. It is measured differently than we do our serum. Normally, in a urinalysis, it's measured semi-quantitatively. We talked about qualitative testing where you get a yes, no, positive, negative, and so forth like that. In chemistry, we're going to be doing quantitative where you get an answer, a flat-out number with the units like milligrams per deciliter. Semi-quantitative is kind of in between. Yes, you have some. Yes, you have a little bit. Yes, you have a whole bunch. You know, so we might say a 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus. Maybe you did something like that in immunology. You didn't give them a number. You just said you've got quite a bit or you don't have very much. Okay, that's normally how we measure urine for glucose, and it's part of the urinalysis dipstick. So we're just visually looking at intensities of color, which we'll be doing this summer. And it is using that glucose oxidase peroxidase method. Obviously, because the hexokinase is UV, we can't see it, right? There is another non-specific method using copper. Glucose is in a category that we call reducing substances, and there are more, and we've talked about the other carbs. And children, especially newborns, could have a reducing substance problem that's not glucose. And so we do a non-specific test, and we will also do this in your analysis, a copper reduction. You can say you've got a reducing substance problem, but I can't tell you which one. Okay? And this we will hit again, but normally you don't have glucose in your urine when your blood gets so high that your kidneys can't take care of it like they're supposed to. The excess spills over, and that's a lot of the older terms, and I'll say it, it spilt over. So it came out of the blood and into the urine because it's so high in the serum, in the blood, okay? That's called the renal threshold. At the point when the renal system can't take it anymore, then it lets it through. You know, just think of it as it's got a hold gate, and the glucose is getting so high, you just can't hold it, and it lets it out. It's a renal threshold, and it starts spilling over. So if you are seeing, especially more than a 1+ or a trace on a specimen urine, then they've got elevated serum, and not just this minute. You know, it took a while to cross through that kidneys. So they're probably either diabetic or on the way to being a diabetic. Spinal fluid, we can use either of the methods that we did for serum. Spinal fluid, you should have glucose because spinal fluid comes from body fluid, not blood directly, but, you know, think about your brain and some of the other cavities that we'll get into when we talk about body fluids. But normally it's 2/3 of whatever your serum is. So if they're looking for something in particular and they do a spinal tap, they should do a venipuncture also at the same time. Well, they're not going to stick my arm if they're doing a spinal tap on me, so they're probably going to collect the blood and then do the spinal tap, or as soon as you get back to your room. Although having a spinal tap is very traumatic, and that could shoot it up, so it would be best to have it right before you go. And then you should look at the two. So if you had a 100 blood, you would expect what in your spinal fluid? 65 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, 2/3. So here are the reference intervals I do want you to know. Fasting from 70 to less than 100. Fasting serum. And your 2-hour PC should be less than 140 milligrams per deciliter. Now, somebody mentioned whole blood. We used to do a lot of testing on whole blood. The glucose meters that you guys operated, those are to be performed on a drop of whole blood. Think about what whole blood is compared to the serum or plasma. Those blood cells are displacing some of the serum. So essentially it's diluting out the volume. So whole blood should be less. Not a lot, and this says 10 to 15%. So if I did a meter and got 90, and the lab collected a venipuncture and spun it down and did it on the plasma and got 100 or 105, I'm fine. Okay? Yeah, I did put 2 type on here. Okay, the process of glycolysis was what? What's that word mean? Glycolysis. Right. That is happening in your cells, and it continues to occur in the cells after you put it in a test tube. Okay, up to a certain point. Eventually it stops. So when you collect blood And say you collected an EDTA blood. Well, even if you collected a clot tube, a red top or a gold top, until it is separated and the cells are taken away from the plasma or the serum, that glycolysis continues. So it's reducing the glucose in the plasma. Okay, so a lot of our places will collect blood, but if they don't test it, they're going to send it across town to another laboratory. A lot of offices just do the collection. So it could be hours before that tube actually gets to the lab and is processed, spun down, and tested. Because of that, we can falsely reduce a patient's glucose. If we put it in the fluoride tubes, the gray tops, it prohibits that glycolysis. That's the main function of a gray top, to prohibit glycolysis. And so they should be collecting them in gray tops, and if it takes all day, 10 hours to get over to your lab, you're all right. Okay? But we do lots of serum, especially if we know we don't have that time frame. We're going to collect it in the hospital or the actual clinic that's running it. They're going to collect a clot tube. As soon as it clots, we're going to spin it. It's got that gel in there to keep them separated. We're fine because I don't have the cells sitting in there doing the glycolysis, eating up that glucose. Okay? Normal spinal fluid is 40 to 70, and that's about 2/3 of a normal serum. A few other disorders are insulinomas. If you've got a tumor on the pancreas, and we alluded to that a little bit. We'll talk about C-peptide in a minute. Inborn errors of metabolism. And I meant to bring a card. Inborn errors of metabolism are genetic problems you're born with, congenital issues maybe. And these listed are some of the more common ones. When babies are born, it is federal law, and the states have the option of adding to. All babies are tested for certain inborn errors of metabolism because the majority of them, if you do something even very simple, you can prevent having major health problems or mental retardation, because a lot of them can cause brain damage. And it's just a matter of prohibiting certain foods or giving them something that they're missing to help them break down these products. And that's what we do with our type 1 diabetics. We give them insulin so they can break down the glucose properly. And galactosemia is a common one. So we test all of our babies. They do a heel stick, and there's a form that I'll try to remember bring it next week. You just saturate some drops of blood on this paper and fill out all this information about it and send it off. And each state lab does a minimum and then maybe some more. You probably heard of PKU. If you haven't, if you look on your sodas, most of them say contains PKU or PKs because that's a pretty common one. And they're missing an enzyme to break it down. So if you don't ingest it, then you're okay. So they have to watch what they eat their whole life. And you learned about hemoglobin. There is a portion of hemoglobin A, fraction 1, and subfraction C, that glucose attaches to. Okay? Well, how long does your red cells live? So it's irreversibly bound, so it's stuck there. So if for 60 days you had a lot of glucose, there are going to be a lot of A1C fractions that have it. Okay, so if we measure that fraction of your hemoglobin, we'll know what a long-term average was. That doesn't mean every day was high, but it wasn't like this, or even like this. It was okay, with maybe a few dips down in there. So we lyse the red cells and measure that component. Okay, and we do this in chemistry generally. And mostly we're given them a percent of the total. 4 to 6% is what an average normal person would be. However, that's what the literature says. I haven't done hemoglobin A1Cs in this area, but where I came from, that was too low. Everybody was 7 or higher. So I really think this is a very restricted population they got their average from, because I think you're going to see more 6 to 7 for your average normal people, which means you're diabetic, they're going to have a hard time staying there all the time. They're going to be a little higher. So the doctor will monitor. They'll probably have the patient come in every quarter, and they're wanting to see that a certain percent they'll come up with, and it's not usually the normal. They don't expect them to get that low, but they'll have a ballpark figure. Say, I want you to be around 8%. Okay, so they're trying to do whatever they need to do to get you at 8%, meaning that most of the time you were there. Now, this is an average of the time period, and we usually go for 3 months because, they'll jump on the hemoglobin right away, but so we usually use it as a 3-month index. And sometimes they just can't get it down, so they're just monitoring, are you staying the same? You're not climbing. That's the best we can do. Okay. But what's nice about it is because it's irreversibly attached to the RBC, it doesn't have anything to do with your immediate ingestion, so it doesn't have to be fasting. Okay. It's usually ran on an EDTA tube, so they can get a CBC and hemoglobin A1C very easily. We need a whole blood because we need the red cells to measure this component. Chromatography methods were the most common. However, we do have some immunoassay reference methods coming out, and I think more and more facilities are going to those. They're cheaper. You can run it on your basic chemistry analyzer, whereas the chromatography, you had to have a piece of equipment, and that's all it ran. However, you usually had so many, it ran all day, doing hundreds of them, because they're pretty slow operation. Some other analytes that we measure concerning diabetes especially, I said type 1 can go into ketoacidosis, so you are spilling ketones that you normally wouldn't have, and so we measure those, usually in the urine, but we can measure in blood or serum, plasma, and we will measure some of those in urinalysis. However, the ketone bodies can come out of your fat cells. So if you have a starvation patient, and sometimes we do, especially young women, will starve on purpose, and they'll spill ketones. It doesn't mean they're diabetic. Their fat is breaking down. That's where it comes from, and it's because they're not eating, and they'll start spilling some ketones. If you go on a really, really strict diet, like a high-protein diet, there was a diet a while back. It was no carbs, high protein. Was that the Atkins? I don't even know what they called it. And those people started spilling ketones, and this is not good. Microalbumin. When you start having your renal problems due to diabetes, when you get, I said end-stage renal disease was one of the major complications. Well, before you get there, you'll start having problems with your kidneys not filtering like they're supposed to. And we know of people sometimes they're type 2, but eventually they went on dialysis because their kidneys have shut down or are almost shut down from the damage. Before they get really bad, protein normally is not supposed to get into your urine. It's a big molecule, it won't cross. But before you get really bad, you start having just enough damage to your cells that little bits of it will cross. Hence the word micro, not meaning that it's super small, but a very small amount will cross of albumin into the urine. that we don't detect in our urinalysis method. It's just a little bit, but it's enough to be significant. And over studies, they found out that if we could measure just that little bit, then we could catch these people that are in the process of beginning and intervene to either delay or hopefully improve so they won't end up in renal stage, end-stage renal disease. And so we came up with a way to measure that in urine, on random urine, little dipstick, where we're doing a comparison of albumin to creatinine. And when we get into the renal chapter, that'll make a little bit of sense. But it's another test that we will do. That's basically talking about it. C-peptide. Your insulin comes from a molecule called proinsulin, which makes sense. It's before insulin. And it's composed of two parts, the insulin and this peptide. And when it separates into the components, it's equal separation. You get one insulin for one component of the peptide. It's a cleaved peptide, so we call it C-peptide. So if we could measure C-peptide, it's just as good or as equivalent to measuring an insulin. We measure C-peptide, but you know, if we can measure insulin, I really cannot tell you why. Who are given insulin, exogenous insulin, doesn't have a C-peptide portion. It's only the insulin. So if you need to know, is this elevated insulin in this person due to them, their endogenous insulin, or is it exogenous, then measure a C-peptide. So if they're the same, then this insulin's all from them because they split equally. But if this insulin is higher than your C-peptide, then you can assume the difference is what was given to that patient. Maybe in the case of like of an overdose, sometimes we do have some people that are really having a hard time regulating, or they don't truly understand, or they get a lot of unnecessary help, and they're giving them injections, taking insulin when they shouldn't be. That might be helpful. But really,